We are continuing our series this morning. In the series we've entitled Disciple, Embracing the Teachings of Jesus, but we're going to deviate slightly from the book that we've been in for the last few weeks. We've been in the Gospel of Matthew, and this morning we're going to look at the Gospel of Mark. I want us to look at the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. This miracle is found in all four Gospels. It's the only miracle in addition to the resurrection that is found in all four Gospels, but there is a perspective that Mark brings to the feeding of the 5,000 as we prepare our hearts for the Lord's Supper that I want us to look at this morning. So we'll be looking at Mark chapter 6, verse 30 through 44. Opposition is growing. Jesus is teaching parables. The disciples are now performing miracles and doing great works. And as we've been saying the last few weeks, because of Jesus' teaching, drawing the line in the sand, there's opposition that is now coming Jesus' way. There's opposition that is coming the disciples' way. Jesus is rejected in his hometown. And then all of a sudden, we see in the Gospels narratives, something significant happen. Herod the king throws a big party. And how does the party end? With John the Baptist's head on a platter. And you can imagine the reaction of the disciples. Is this it? Is this what this all comes down to? You're telling me if John the Baptist's head ends up on a platter, does following Jesus Christ and his teachings, is this how my life results in? And here in Mark chapter 6, verse 30 through 43, the disciples need to be reconvened and regathered by Jesus because the disciples are besides themselves. They are exhausted. They are weary. They are scared for their life. And Jesus, as the good shepherd, reconvenes his disciples. And that's what we read here in Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. And now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy them something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds, by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. And the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our Lord, it stands forever. Amen. Leadership truly does matter. Leadership in any organization makes or breaks that organization. Leadership matters in businesses, in families, in communities, in churches and schools, in any place where people convene. Good leadership matters. And the disciples here were desperate for a leader. They were desperate for good leadership. When their lives and their ministries seemed like it was falling apart, when their lives and their ministries seemed like they were being turned upside down, the disciples here in this moment just seeing and witnessing and experiencing John the Baptist's head on a platter. They're desperate for their leader to bring them back together again, to give them a good word. For the last few weeks, we've been studying what it means to be a disciple. Well, to be a disciple means you have what? You have a leader. To be a disciple means you're a student. To be a disciple means you are a follower, that you have a leader, a teacher, a shepherd. The disciples were craving one. All throughout the Old Testament, the people of God were desperate for a leader. The motif that we see many times through the Old Testament is that of a shepherd. David often talks about the Lord is my shepherd. But it wasn't just a shepherd in a pastoral sense. The shepherd that the people of God longed for was a shepherd king, the perfect shepherd. And we see plenty of instances throughout the Old Testament of not only good shepherds, but we see instances of bad shepherds. We see shepherds who are more concerned with feeding themselves than feeding their sheep. So all throughout redemptive history in the Old Testament, the people of God are longing for a leader. They're longing for one that they liken to a shepherd king. And here in the Gospel of Mark, we see Jesus referred to as what? A shepherd. He has compassion on the people because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. And so we see here this morning in the Gospel of Mark chapter 6, before we go to the Lord's table, we learn about Jesus as the perfect fulfillment of the shepherd king that the people of God longed for. And whether you realize it or not, your heart longs for as well this morning. Let's look at what it means to follow the shepherd king. The first thing that we learn about Jesus as the shepherd here in this passage is we see the compassion of the shepherd. We see the compassion of the shepherd in verses 30 through 34. We see this compassion of the shepherd, of Jesus as the shepherd of the people of God. We see compassion in his treatment of two groups of people. We see compassion in his treatment of the disciples. In verse 31, what does Jesus say? He says to the disciples, "Come away by yourself to a desolate place and rest a while." He sees the disciples, like I said in the introduction of this passage, these disciples have been on the road performing miracles, doing ministry, and then finally they see the great leader, the one who was preaching about Jesus in the wilderness, ends up with his head on a platter. You can imagine the exhaustion of the disciples. You can imagine the exhaustion of these men. All for what? And you see the compassion of Jesus in his treatment of the disciples, looking at them weary and wounded and exhausted. And he looks at them, and we see the compassion of the shepherd by the way he responds to them. He doesn't go immediately into teaching them. He doesn't go immediately into corrective mode. He doesn't immediately go, hey, let's paint the big picture and give you a vision casting so you can keep marching on for the next 3 months. He just says, let's call a time out. Let's go to a desolate place. Let's go rest. Isn't that beautiful? The perfect shepherd looks at his men. He looks at the under-shepherds. He looks at the disciples. And he says, you need a time out. You're weary. And you're heavy laden. And you're wounded. And you're exhausted. And isn't that how Jesus looks at us this morning? He looks at us in our exhaustion. He might look at us and we're weary. He might look at us and we're at the end of the line. We're at the end of our rope. And Jesus looks at us this morning as the good shepherd. And even this morning as we enter into Lord's Day worship and we come to the table of the Lord, it's his invitation for us this morning to come away and rest. Jesus has compassion as the good shepherd. But we not only see the compassion with the treatment of the disciples, but we also see it with the treatment of the crowd. We see the compassion with the way he responds to the crowd. And in verse 34, it says, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. And he had compassion on them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. What was going on here? The Sea of Galilee was like a big bowl, like a stadium. And you could walk around it and run around it, and Jesus there is with his disciples, and they're in the boat, and you can just envision the boat would go one way and the crowd would run one direction, and you'd be in a boat and they'd go to the other direction and the crowd would run. And so what does he see? Jesus sees these crowds coming and going and running to the right and to the left, and what does Jesus say? He looks at them in their confusion. He looks at them scrambling, and his heart breaks for them. He sees people running with no direction. He sees people running with no shepherd. He sees people running with no leadership and no shepherd. And it says that Jesus' heart broke. He had compassion on them because they were a sheep, like a sheep without a shepherd. How about you this morning? Does your heart break? Can you identify with what Jesus is saying here, or what they're saying about Jesus? Does your heart break when you see people with no direction, when you see people with no hope, when you see people that have come to the end of the line or the end of the rope? Can you identify Jesus' first reaction? Once again, he had it with the disciples, and then he has it with the crowd. Does not go into correction mode, does not go into fix-it mode, but his heart breaks. If somebody was to describe you in 5 words, somebody was to describe you in 10 words, would compassion be one of them? That your heart breaks for people that are empty, that your heart breaks for people that are leaderless, that your heart breaks for people that are wandering through life with no direction and no hope and no joy. This is the heart and the compassion of the shepherd. So we see it in the way that he treats the disciples, and we see it in the way that he treats the crowd. We see the deep compassion of the shepherd. And the only thing that will move you and I to be compassionate people is when we have ourselves experienced the compassion of Jesus. We ourselves have experienced the compassion of the shepherd. But the second thing that we see here about the shepherd, we not only see the compassion of the shepherd, we see the sacrifice of the shepherd. Verses 35 through 37, we learn about the sacrifice of the shepherd. It says that there's a mob here, right? There's a crowd. It tells us at the very end there's 5,000 people. And so the disciples come up with a pretty good plan, right? What does it say? The disciples are listening to Jesus teach. It's getting late into the day. And what do they say? They say in verse 35, this is a desolate place and the hour is now late. And here's their game plan. Very pragmatic, very practical. It's probably a game plan you and I would come up with ourselves. They say, hey, there's 5,000 people here. Let's send everybody out along their way, and everybody gets dinner on their own tonight. Right? There's no way we can feed 5,000 people here. Right? Sounds reasonable? Seems very pragmatic and practical. But what does Jesus say? No, not so fast. We're not going to let them go on their way. Dinner's not on your own tonight. But Jesus looks at them and he says to his disciples, you give them something to eat. What is Jesus teaching them there in that moment? He's teaching them the service of sacrifice. He's teaching them the life of sacrifice. He's teaching, the good shepherd is teaching the future shepherds of the people of God what ministry and life would look like, that your life is not for yourself, but your life is to be laid down for others. Because it would be Jesus himself, the perfect shepherd, that just in a few chapters in Mark chapter 10 would say that the Son of Man has come what? Not to be served, but to serve, even serving by giving his life for a ransom for many. See, Jesus, the perfect shepherd, is beginning to teach the under-shepherds. He's beginning to teach those that would follow after him that your life is not for yourself, but your life is one of selfless sacrifice for others. And it is here that Jesus is beginning to model and teach that no, we will not send them on their way. And you will not even eat first yourself, but we will provide for everyone. So there is no more need. This is the model. This is the life. This is the selfless service of the shepherd. in which he calls those that would follow after him as disciples, that if we truly are followers of Jesus Christ, if we truly count ourselves as disciples of Jesus Christ, of the great and perfect shepherd, that this is what our lives should model. This is what our lives should look like. That in light of Jesus and his perfect sacrifice for us, not willing to be served, but to serve others, even willing to lay down his life for us, that as his disciples, this is what our life would look like. The perfect shepherd preparing the future shepherds, the perfect shepherd preparing the future disciples, that this is what life and selfless sacrifice would look like. No, they will not feed themselves, but you will feed them, and you will feed them first until there is no more need. So we see the compassion of the shepherd. We see the sacrifice of the shepherd. And then lastly, we see the satisfaction of the shepherd. We see the satisfaction of him. In verse 38 through 44, we see a people that are hungry. We see a people that are in need. But what is the context? Where are these people? Where are these thousands of people that are starving and hungry? It says it 3 times in the passage, which means we probably should pay attention to it. The desolate place. Mark tells us it's in the desolate place that he takes the disciples. It's in the desolate place that he teaches. It's in the desolate place in which we possibly can't find enough food to feed 5,000 people. Why is that significant? Because it's in the desolate place. What's the desolate place? It's in the wilderness. There is nothing in the wilderness because it's desolate, it's barren, it's empty, it's lifeless. But it would be in the desolate place where God would show up in amazing ways of abundance. And what does he do here? And how does he show the satisfaction of the great shepherd in the midst of desolation and in the midst of emptiness? Well, we see here in verse 39 that he commands the groups to sit where? In the green grass. Where have we seen green grass before in the scriptures? Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, for he has me lie down in green grass, in the green pastures. And so you can imagine Mark's reaction under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit as he's recording this passage and understanding the Old Testament, going, the shepherd who would come to lead sheep without a shepherd to the green grass. And here he is, a shepherd leading his sheep, leading the sheep to where? Green grass. Where? In the middle of desolation, in the middle of a place that shouldn't have green grass. Don't miss that. That's part of the miracle. Often we look at this passage and we just focus on the miracle of feeding 5,000, and that is tremendous. But the fact that there is green grass in the middle of a desolate place. Green grass was always synonymous with abundance. It was synonymous with life. And what Jesus is teaching here about himself as the perfect shepherd, that it is in the midst of lifelessness that he brings life. In the midst of desolation, he brings abundance. That is the miracle of the great shepherd. But not only does he lead them to green grass, what happens after that? After he has them sit down, or as Leon Morris says, a better translation is to recline as one is getting ready to feast. What happens? 41, taking the loaves, he looks up to heaven and he breaks it and he divides it among them. And in verse 42, it says, all ate and all were satisfied. When was the last time people in the wilderness were fed? Manna from heaven. Manna from heaven, where they would look up to the heavens, and it would be not in the land of abundance, not in the land of plenty, but it would be in the wilderness in the Old Testament that they would look up to the heavens and God would rain down what? Manna from heaven. What Jesus is doing here is he's recreating for us this beautiful picture of redemption that we saw in the Old Testament, that God would be in the wilderness and where there would be nothing, and then all of a sudden there would be an abundance. Green grass, enough food, so it says in verse 42 that all would eat and all would be satisfied. This is what the great shepherd does. And this is reason for great hope this morning, because I know there are people here this morning that find themselves in a desolate place. I know there are people this morning that find themselves wandering through the wilderness, and there is no hope, and there is no joy, and there is no peace, and there is no comfort. And Jesus says, through me and only through me, as the great and perfect shepherd, in the midst of desolation, will you find life. In the middle of the wilderness, you will find an abundance. And it will be the very thing and the only thing that fully satisfies you forever. It would be Jesus himself in John chapter 6, where he would say to the disciples, I am the bread of life. And in verse 33 of chapter 6, this is what he says, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the true bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Brothers and sisters, if you want life, it comes through the bread of heaven, which is Jesus Christ. He is the bread of heaven. He is the perfect manna. The perfect shepherd provides himself as the bread of life for you and me to be fully satisfied. And I love the reaction of the disciples in verse 34 of chapter 6. What do they say? Sir, give us this bread always. Sir. It's not just something they say in Alabama, but right here, sir, give us this bread always. What a beautiful prayer. What a beautiful reaction that Jesus is presenting himself as the bread of life, and all they can say and respond is, sir, give us this bread. Have you said that prayer this morning? Sir, give us this bread. There are hungry people out there this morning, desperate for their souls to be satisfied. And you yourself might be hungry today. And in the quietness of your heart, you can say right now, sir, Jesus, give me bread. And they say, sir, give me bread always, because I don't have life apart from you. Jesus is the perfect shepherd who gives us himself as the bread of heaven in a world that is starving and thirsty to be satisfied and trying everything under the sun to find hope and meaning and forgiveness and purpose. You can find it this morning in the person and work of Jesus Christ. Would you be led by the shepherd this morning and allow him to lead you to the green grass and allow him to feed you in such a way that you have the bread of life, the bread of heaven, in which you'll never be hungry again. You'll never be satisfied. Listen to me closely. You will never be satisfied apart from this bread, apart from the bread of life. And how do we receive the bread this morning? You only receive it by breaking it. Whole bread cannot be consumed. The bread must be broken and torn in pieces. And it's the beautiful picture of Jesus breaking the bread that in just a few chapters, we would see a body broken. We would see a body torn so that you might receive it. Jesus' body broken so that you can be made whole. Jesus' body torn so that your hope can be restored. At the end of World War II, there was thousands upon thousands of children that were displaced into orphanages. And these children, in one orphanage in particular in Germany, the children were so distressed and so distraught that they were not able to sleep at night except for one thing. They would hand every child a piece of bread. And it was the piece of bread being held in their hands that it would allow them to sleep. Why? Because as they were rocking the children to sleep, they would say, "There's bread for tomorrow. There's bread for tomorrow. There's bread for tomorrow." Brothers and sisters, in just a few moments, the elders of your church will place a piece of bread in your hand and give you the hope that there's bread for tomorrow, the bread of life, the bread of heaven broken for you, the bread of life and heaven torn in pieces so that you would be made whole. The only way you receive this is through faith. The only reason you can recline at the table this morning is because Jesus was broken so that you would be made whole. Sir, would you give us this bread? Sir, would you give us this bread always?